And the way that I always construct the game to sort of, if you try to memorize the entire game, it can be complicated, but there's a simple way of constructing it. The way that I do it is I start from the bottom and work my way around. So it goes like this. Imagine that we have C, and we're just going to alternate it, right? C, D, C, D, and then we go D, and now make sense of this, D, C, C. Okay? So this is how the game starts. And what we're trying to do is we're attempting to think of all the possible outcomes that can happen in this game. And there are many. Okay. So now we've constructed our table, right? Now we can begin the game. So the second thing to do, we need to use our terms C and D, and then the next thing that we need to do is that we need to alternate on one half. On the right half, we alternate, and then we replicate these, right? So it's C, D, C, D, 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 C, C. There are many different ways you construct it. This is the way that I construct it because it's easy for me to memorize. And then we alternate. Next thing we do is alternate C's and D's, right? So we use those terms C and D, and then we alternate it as follows. C, D, C, D, 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 C, C. Okay, so that's the next thing that we do. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to actually see what the values are. Again, different formulations of the game will use different values. The number, the numerical value that's used is not important, right? The ratio of the value is important, like how the value is weighted is very important. But this particular numerical value is my sort of formulation of the game, but it doesn't matter what numbers you actually use, right? As long as the relationship between their answers, their ability to cooperate is the same. Okay, now remember we said, what does D mean? Well, defect. Well, if a person defects in the game, then the person is going to tell on the other person. If the person cooperates, the person is going to remain silent, right? So if the person defects, the person effectively snitches on the other person, right? So we can think of this defecting as, right? You can think of defecting as effectively snitching, right? And if the person cooperates, the person remains silent, right? The person doesn't say anything, right? So you can think of the person who remains silent as not having any value at all, right? They don't say anything. So if the person defects, the person tells on the other person. The person snitches on the other person. If the person cooperates, the person doesn't say anything. When asked a question, the person remains silent. Okay, now let's see what happens. Imagine, so this column will be for Bob. This is Bob's column, and this is Jane's column. Okay, so we have our two people. We have Bob's column, what Bob says when asked, and we have Jane's column. We know that if we see defect, then the person snitches on the other person. If we see a C, the person cooperates, and the person doesn't say anything at all. Okay, the next thing to recognize is the level of punishment, right? So this is going to be this column, after their name, is going to be the sentence. How many years are they sentenced to prison, right? So this will be their prison sentence. And this will too. Okay, so the first column is their response, and we'll put response. The first column is their response. The second column is their prison sentence. And then the last column is where we'll assess with their variable. We'll make an assessment of the level of engagement, right? So this is the last is the assessment. We'll put variable. Variable. Yeah. All right. So we have three columns. Their response, the person's response. The next column is the number of years that they're sentenced to prison. And the last column is the variable, and I guess I should put assessment. A-S-S-E-S-M-E-T. A-S-S-E-S. Okay. So, 3 columns for Bob, 3 columns for Jane. So, now we can see that we're ready to actually begin sort of inserting some of these numbers and drawing conclusions from this. The third thing that obviously that we did, the first thing we used our term C and D, we alternated our term C and D, and then we labeled our columns. Right? And now we begin the game. The last thing is begin game by plugging in. Begin the game by plugging in numbers. Alright, so reward, sucker, defect or snitching, cooperating, punishment, temptation. We have our parties and our 3 columns. Alright. Now, imagine that Bob is asked about Jane, and Bob doesn't know, he doesn't know what the consequences of this game will be. He doesn't know what the consequences of the game will be. All that he knows is that at the end of this, as long as, no matter what he says about Jane, if he goes and he snitches on Jane effectively, he defects and he snitches on her, then Jane will not know that he did. Jane knows exactly the same. She knows that whatever's disclosed in this room is between me and you, right? If you snitch on Bob, if you tell me that Bob did it, then, you know, Bob's going to be punished. And I won't let Bob know that you told me this, right? So there's an air of confidentiality that's securing the game, right? That's allowing the participants to actually engage themselves in playing the game. Alright, so the next thing that we have to do is we have to figure out the number of years for the prison sentence. And as I said, you can use any numbers that you want, but the ratios need to be the same, and I'll talk about that in a second.